Solomon Asch and the Power of the Crowd. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted one of the most deceptively simple experiments in the history of social psychology. His question was straightforward: if you can clearly see that something is wrong, will you still say it is right if everyone around you says otherwise? The experiment involved lines. Participants were shown a target line and several comparison lines. Their task was simply to identify which comparison line was the same length as the target. The correct answer was generally obvious. There was no complicated mathematics, no political ideology, and no ambiguity requiring expert knowledge. But there was a catch. The participant was placed in a room with several other people who were actually working with the experimenter. On certain trials, these actors deliberately gave the same incorrect answer. One by one, they would confidently identify the wrong line. Then it was the real participants' turn. The remarkable finding was that many participants eventually went along with the group, even when the correct answer was visually obvious. Asch demonstrated something much more profound than the idea that people are easily fooled. He demonstrated that social agreement can compete with individual perception. A person can see the truth and still feel pressure to deny what they see. That distinction becomes extremely important when we move beyond the laboratory and into politics, religion, ideology, fandom, social media, and especially mass media. The psychological cost of disagreement. Why would somebody give an answer they know is wrong? Part of the answer is conformity. Humans are intensely social creatures. We constantly monitor other people for information about what is normal, acceptable, safe, and true. When everyone around us agrees, their agreement becomes evidence in itself. The individual may begin asking, how could all these people be wrong? This creates a conflict between two forms of information. There is private perception. I can see the answer is B. And there is social information. Everyone else is saying A. When the social pressure becomes strong enough, some people will sacrifice their private judgment in order to preserve social harmony. And this is where Asch becomes relevant to the phenomenon of ideological echo chambers. The modern equivalent of Asch's laboratory isn't necessarily a room full of strangers. It might be a smartphone. From the laboratory to the media ecosystem. Imagine taking Asch's experiment and replacing the actors sitting around the table with a modern media ecosystem. Instead of 6 people saying, the answer is A, you might have, my favorite radio host says A. His callers say A. His audience agrees with him. The comments are filled with people saying A. Everyone on our side knows A is true. The individual is now surrounded by a much larger social environment reinforcing the same conclusion. The crucial difference is that the modern participant doesn't necessarily experience this as pressure. Nobody has to threaten them. Nobody has to order them to agree. The conformity can happen almost invisibly. The person repeatedly encounters the same interpretation of reality until disagreement begins to feel abnormal. This is where charismatic personalities become particularly powerful. A radio host, television personality, YouTuber, podcaster, political commentator, financial guru, or religious leader can become something more than a source of information. They can become a social reference point. The audience doesn't merely ask, is this claim true? They begin asking, what does someone like me believe about this? That is a fundamentally different psychological question. The charismatic personality as the group. Asch's original experiment depended upon a group. But a charismatic media personality can effectively recreate the group psychologically. Consider someone who has listened to the same host for 10 years. The host's voice may accompany the listener during their commute, their morning routine, their lunch break, and their evening. The listener hears the host's opinions. They hear callers agreeing with the host. They hear recurring phrases and assumptions. They hear stories about people who supposedly represent the opposing side. Eventually, the personality can become psychologically familiar in a way that resembles a member of the listener's social world. This creates an unusual phenomenon. The individual may feel socially connected to someone who doesn't know they exist. And yet the psychological influence can still be real. The audience member isn't simply consuming information. They are participating in a perceived community. That community provides belonging, identity, humor, enemies, heroes, vocabulary, and explanations for why the world is the way it is. At that point, challenging the personality's worldview can become psychologically expensive. You aren't merely challenging an argument. You may be challenging your community. The blinder effect. This connects directly to what we might call the blinder effect. Once people become strongly identified with a group, information is no longer evaluated in isolation. Information is filtered through identity. A statement that supports the group feels plausible. A statement that threatens the group feels suspicious. A source associated with the opposing group can be dismissed before its evidence is even considered. The psychological question subtly changes from, "Is this true?" to, "Whose side is this information on?" This is one reason ideological polarization can become so difficult to reverse. The problem isn't necessarily a lack of information. Sometimes people have access to enormous amounts of information. The problem is that information is being processed through a social identity. From conformity to conviction. Perhaps the most fascinating part is what happens after repeated conformity. At first, the individual may simply pretend to agree. They know privately that the group is wrong but don't want to stand out. But repeated exposure can eventually produce something more complicated. The person may begin doubting their own perception. Maybe I'm missing something. Then, maybe the host understands this better than I do. Then, actually, maybe everyone else really is wrong. Eventually, the person may genuinely adopt the group's interpretation. This creates a progression. Conformity identification internalization. The person begins by saying what the group says. Then they begin thinking like the group. Eventually, they may experience the group's beliefs as their own independent conclusions. That is where the distinction between persuasion and conformity becomes blurry. The modern echo chamber. Social media can intensify this process because algorithms can surround people with increasingly similar opinions. The individual may believe, "Everyone thinks this way." But they aren't actually observing society. They are observing a filtered representation of society. The digital environment creates a strange illusion of consensus. The same phenomenon can occur with talk radio, television networks, political communities, religious organizations, investment communities, and fandoms. The person repeatedly encounters people who agree with them, while disagreement becomes increasingly invisible. This creates what might be called manufactured consensus. The individual doesn't necessarily need to be convinced that an idea is true. They only need to become convinced that everyone like them already believes it. And once that happens, disagreement itself begins to look suspicious. The most important lesson from Asch. The enduring lesson of Asch's experiments is not that people are weak-minded. It is that human perception is social. We don't experience reality as completely isolated individuals. We constantly use other people as reference points. That is normally an enormous advantage. We learn from one another. We cooperate. We share knowledge. We avoid danger. We develop culture. But the same mechanism that allows society to function can also be exploited. A charismatic personality can become the reference point. The audience can become the reinforcing crowd. The media ecosystem can become the laboratory. And eventually, the individual may find themselves surrounded by thousands or millions of people saying, "This is obviously true." The most important question then becomes the same question Asch was asking 70 years ago. What happens when you can see something for yourself, but everyone you trust is telling you that you are seeing it wrong? That may be one of the fundamental psychological questions of the modern media age.
Is this you talking or the